All right. Pascal's wager, the infinities problem. This is not the mini-God problem. It's a separate problem that has to do with, suppose the mini-gods problem is already overcome, and we're comparatively evaluating the utilitarian return from belief and non-belief in the specifically Christian God. Under one theodicy, the return from non-belief in God is negative infinity. That would be eternal torment. I don't really subscribe to that, but let's say that there's some possibility that it's true. Another theodicy would be destruction, in which the person would cease to exist. The utilitarian return is 0. So it's not negative, but it's not positive. If you average the two, you get a negative infinity. But here's the problem with averaging infinity, is that infinity comes in different. First of all, infinity is not a number. So we need to get into set theory. I'll have a link to my blog. Some of this set theory stuff is better described in text. But let's describe infinity. The sort of normal infinity is the counting set. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is like the baseline infinity. And you keep going up linearly to a linear unitary infinity. And there are different sizes of infinity. So the linear set is always preferred to, let's say, for example, the set of half. You linearly increase half. 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, so forth. The limit, infinity, is never obtained. It's never actually realized. And I'm going to argue that even theologically, it's never realized. But on any particular instance, let's suppose each set element corresponds to a day for convenience. So day 1, there's a happiness value of 1 versus 0.5. It's preferred on day 1. 2, there's a happiness value of 2 to 1. 3 to 1.5. 4 to 2. You can see that the unitary set is always preferred on any given day. You finitely increase retrospectively. It's always preferred. And it doesn't matter how many days go by. You would always have been better off, linearly better off in this case. You would always have been better off to select the option 1. This is interesting from an opportunity cost point of view. From an opportunity cost point of view, there's actually no difference between negative infinity and 0. Supposing a nonlinear increase. So we don't actually know the linearity of the infinity which obtains. We can't stipulate that. We can stipulate that for the sake of argument, but we don't actually know. So suppose instead of 1, 2, 3, it's 1, 4, 9. So you have an exponential non-converging positive increase. By the time you get to 9, on the exponential increase, compare that to a linear positive 1, 2, 3, the gap is growing, and it grows exponentially, so that at some point, it's actually isomorphic to an alternate case where you're having a decreasing linear and a less increasing positive. So you can normalize the non-preferred case to 0, so it's just 0, 0, 0, and then you're just getting different shapes in the increasing case. And this is done frequently in economic analysis because we have a concept of zero profits. So in the real world, a guy can lose his money, but theoretically we can plot this as zero profit in an optimal case. So economics is called the pessimistic science because they actually do the reverse. Instead of a baseline of 0 and going up from there, we do a maximum of zero profit, and it just gets worse from there. It actually doesn't matter. As long as you have a baseline, if you're differencing two curves, you can always normalize so that one curve is the baseline and that the other curve is either positive or negative. It actually doesn't matter because they're isomorphic. That is to say, they're technically the same from a differencing point of view. It's just that the difference is which curve are you normalizing. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, the difference is 1, 2, 3. And that would be with a positive limit. And then if I take the positive limit and normalize it so that the positive limit is 0, 0, 0, now I'm -1, -2, -3. The difference is what matters. Okay? So there's actually no difference between, this sounds counterintuitive, but it's what happens when you deal with infinity as if it were a number. There's no difference between infinity, negative infinity utility and 0 utility. And there's no difference between positive infinity utility and 0 utility. It depends on how you compare them. And this is why we need to use set theory, and this is why it's It doesn't make much sense to talk about infinity as if it were a number, unless you're implicitly referring, as mathematicians often do, you're implicitly referring to some sort of set, which is a non-convergent set. By the way, we need to point out that given an infinite time series, there is the case where it converges to a finite number, right? So you can actually have infinite amount of time, and if the curve is shaped so, you can have finite utility over an infinite period. Okay, and that case is actually not dealt with at all in the Liz versus Alex debate. So it needs to be dealt with. So there's a possibility of a convergent series, in which case you can compare finite and non-finite. I think Liz wants to steer away from that because she's afraid of the possibility where the non-Christian has such a subjective preference that it overcomes the infinite finite limit. And she even hints at this. You can even go back and check the debate. And I think the guy's name is Cameron, the host of Capturing Christianity. He hints at this, but in a non-temporal fashion, where he goes, let's just suppose we don't use infinity. We talk about winning the lottery. It's $1 million, it's $1 billion, it's $1 trillion, it's a Googleplex dollars. As long as it's a finite number, then it's clear that the 99% election versus the 1% election towards the large mass of payoff, the high percent always wins. And that's ultimately true. When you go over to set theory, that's still true. Because of the reason I gave earlier, 1, 2, 3 is always preferred to 0.5, 1, 1.5. They all approach positive infinity, but that's not what matters. What matters is on any particular day, retrospectively, you sum, and you always prefer option 1. So this is the solution to the infinity problem. So that we can say, suppose a few different things. Suppose 1, whether there's a negative infinity payoff or a 0 payoff to non-belief, doesn't matter. Let's normalize it to 0. And let's just say that whatever it is, it's bad. It's worse than belief. It becomes an interesting question whether belief is non-convergent, convergent, linearly non-convergent, exponentially non-convergent. In any case, you either end up with a fixed or an infinite preference to belief as t approaches infinity, but t never gets to infinity. So let's look at it on a day-by-day basis. Let's say, I die, resurrection, judgment, and now you're in heaven. And what does a good day look like? I would actually agree with Alex here that the concept of positive infinity utility doesn't actually even make sense. I like what happened at one point in the discussion where Liz reflected on, let's just suppose it's like a good day, or even like a great day. So it could be as good as, you got a good grade or a raise in your job, or it could be a great day, like you got married, something like this. It could be even better than that. But in no case does it seem necessary to me that we stipulate a positive infinity utility on a given day. It can just be a finite utility. And the fact that this is like a finite decomposition of the infinity problem, and it works. And so that's how you overcome the issue. If you want to work with proportions, you can do that too. So that if there's like some proportional preference, 99 to 1 or whatever, you're just dealing with a proportional set, 0.99, and then whatever it would be, 1.98, 2.97. I think I'm doing that math correctly. So it's still more than 0. So that's the key solution. I'll run through another several possible solutions or interesting notes. One is process modeling. So here we're not dealing with some abstract curve of utility. We're actually thinking about a process, and I think this is really important. And this is what I do, maybe not wittingly, but this is what I do in my original solution, my original steel manning of Pascal's wager. Link in the description. Is I say, let's separate the process. First, you need to decide whether you want to be religious or not. Then given that you're religious, and then you want to choose religion because there's several religions, not any religion, but there's several of them that promise positive eternal rewards. Eternal not being equal to a utilitarian value of infinity. Eternal is just a time statement. Day after day after day after day, you'll be getting rewards. On any of those given days, it could be a fixed reward. And in fact, I think it needs to be. I'm open to changing on that, but the idea of infinity utility doesn't really make sense to me. But you can picture a heaven where every day is like a good day, or at least it's like a better day than before you were in heaven, right? And it's certainly a better day than the alternative of not existing or being in torment. That's all you really need. So from a process gating point of view, you don't multiply by infinities. It's like a logical program, like I'm a software programmer. So it would be a function that determines whether you're going to be religious first, and then it's a stepwise function in math. And this is another solution, is a stepwise function. So you can do a set theory, finite decomposition to overcome the infinity problem, or you can do a stepwise function solution. And that's really intuitive to me because it maps onto the theodicy very well, that you would want to actually look at the process of this. First, you decide whether or not you're going to become religious. Then given that you're religious, there's only a few finite number. There's not an infinite number of religions. There's a finite number of religions for you to select from. Let's just say 3. Let's just say Judaism, Islam, Christianity. So the argument that I make all the way in my original steel manning is that here you would want to optimize for feasibility. Judaism and Islam, they are religions of works, so that you can like try your hardest and still maybe not get the eternal reward if you don't do your prayers right or whatever. In Christianity, it's unique. It's a unique religion because you can have salvation by faith alone. This is a particular doctrine that may not apply to all denominations of Christianity, but I would prefer those denominations that do support the doctrine of faith alone. I ascribe to the doctrine of faith alone. In this doctrine, there's virtually no work. There's like a little bit of a theological debate that I don't want to get into, whether or not faith counts as a work itself. I don't think it does. But even if it does, it's like one really easy work on our part as a human. Obviously, God did some really difficult works, including the crucifixion, which would be really hard. But we don't have to do that in this theodicy. And so that would be the choice that you would want to make because it's super feasible access to eternal reward, whether that eternal reward converges or not. Okay, so eternal reward doesn't need to correspond to an infinite reward. So we can avoid the infinity problem. So process gating is one way to fix this. Collapse from the possibility of Unitarianism. So here's another Christian possible thing is that Unitarianism could be true. That is, if you're a non-believer, you could go to hell, and basically, like, what is the quality of hell? We don't really know. It could be a situation where it could just be like this life, you know? Maybe it's just like you keep having to live this life until you learn that you should follow God, and you voluntarily, at some point, make this choice to follow God. And so then ultimately everyone gets to heaven. I don't actually really ascribe to this, but I'm open to it. Unitarianism, there's more and less sophisticated forms, but it's possible. So if we're doing the naive infinity as a number, which doesn't exist, but if we do that, you would get positive infinity from belief in the first place. And then you would get expected negative infinity from non-belief, because you're averaging between 0 and negative infinity. You would get expected negative infinity, but then you would plus another infinity and get to 0. Now, here's the problem, is that if you add positive and negative infinity, you might not get 0. If you're dealing with set theory and you add the positive linear 1, 2, 3 and the negative linear -1, -2, -3, that will add to 0. But mathematicians will tell you, if you just take infinity itself without delving into set theory, you could end up with a negative number, a 0, a positive number, any of those, and you could end up with an infinity. And the reason is because consider the following: the positive linear set 1, 2, 3, the negative double linear set -2, -4, -6. You add those infinities up and you get a negative infinity, the negative linear set. This is why you need to get into set theory to solve the infinity problem. Now, given that we go into set theory, and this would be a quantitative process model. So it's a stepwise function and a set theory. So this is like kind of like using both the previous tools, but adding the spin of Unitarianism. And what you end up getting is something like, let's say we normalize to 0. So non-belief just gets you 0, and it could be some negative number, but we'll just add that to the rewards from belief. So let's say that the rewards from belief are actually 2, 4, 6. On the naive assumption that it's a single linear return. So you got 2, 4, 6, and then on non-belief you have 0, 0, 0 until time n, where you finally say, you know what, I'm going to go to heaven. And then you start getting 1, 2, 3. And it would be a 1, 2, 3 because 1, 2, 3 is the original reward from belief. It wouldn't be 2, 4, 6 because 2, 4, 6 was the original reward from belief plus the normalized negative. So you can see in this case, everyone ends up getting quote unquote infinity. So on the naive infinity comparison, it fails to ambiguate and Pascal's is defeated. But on the set theory perspective, at any given time t, you would have been better off, in this case linearly better off, but still better off, by choosing to believe from the beginning. So there's kind of like some optimistic results here. One optimistic result is that everyone gets to positive infinity. Another optimistic result is that Pascal's wager wins in a sense. It only wins if you're purely optimizing on your utility at any given finite time. But it's assuming a rational indifference between pre-heaven utility. Let's say that you have a strong preference in favor of atheism in pre-resurrection utility. Again, I think the idea of infinity utility is kind of incoherent, but it could be a large fixed number. Liz is, I think, sort of afraid of this because she doesn't want to bite the bullet, because if it's a large fixed number, it's possible that the atheist could prefer it if that fixed number overcomes the heavenly reward. I say let's bite the bullet. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, I think if you bite the bullet, there's no bullet to bite, because you would naively assume a linear infinite set. It's possible you could have non-convergence. It's possible you could have a linear set. It's possible you could have an exponential set. The null hypothesis would just be a linear, unless you have some reason to think otherwise. And even if you do have a reason to think otherwise, what's the result? The result is that it's still optimal, because Unitarianism could be true, still optimal all around. And if Unitarianism is false, the atheist following their preference seems to be the justified moral situation, right? If it really is their preference, let's say that they irrationally do have an infinite negative utility to belief, which would be isomorphic to an infinite positive utility pre-resurrection for non-belief. They're like just like infinitely into video games, and they just want to play video games until they die. Video games are cool, man. I don't think they're that cool, but go for it. So if on that criteria you still choose non-belief, no harm, no foul. It's infinitely valuable to you. Why would you ever complain? It's infinitely valuable. Why would you complain that something happens after resurrection? Because you've already incorporated that and optimized on it. So I don't think there's like a real bullet to bite here, because at the end of the day, everyone's doing kind of what's optimal for them. I can say that I would prefer belief in this situation, but so what if the atheist possibly has what I consider to be an incoherently large utility from non-belief? Let them do it. I don't think that faults God's moral system somehow. Okay. So we talked about process gating. We talked about finite decomposition of infinity. We talked about potential collapse from Unitarianism. And what would happen here in the collapse of Unitarian? Yeah. So eventually everyone is getting positive utility, but still there would be more positive utility for any finite time for original belief. So it still favors original belief. We talked about the incoherence of infinite utility, and that I would prefer maximal possible utility as a finite k. I think that's a better representation. And it's, by the way, as soon as you do a maximum possible utility, which is a finite k, the whole probability thing goes through and Pascal wins, okay? So really, the person who wants to reject Pascal's wager needs to hang on the possibility of the coherence of single time T1 infinite utility. So I think Liz is kind of afraid of this. Like, let's not allow for finite utilities because it might make non-belief rational. I say bite that bullet because really the infinities is not doing Pascal's wager in favors. It's actually better for Pascal's wager if we don't have infinities. Whether we accomplish that through a finite set decomposition, which I think is preferred, or if we just do I don't want to deal with set theory, but it's still going to be some maximum possible utility K. In either case, those favor Pascal's wager. And in the case where K is maximal possible utility, there could be no super K negative for non-belief because it's the maximal possible utility. The best you can get to is 0, indifference. And again, I think it does nothing to undermine the moral quality of the judgment, resurrection, etc. Okay, and so incoherence of infinite utility was another interesting note in solving from set theory. Preservation of proportions in set theory. Yeah. So one thing they sort of hint at in the Liz O'Connor debate is the possibility of set theory. And this actually, the possibility of proportions as a solution to the infinities problem. And this works as a solution, but it only works in combination of set theory, which they keep ignoring. But I'll show you how it works. Because what Liz does is say, suppose there's 2 doors, and there could be n doors. It's just 2 for simplicity. Suppose there's 2 doors. They both lead to infinite return. One is a 99% chance. Like somehow, this is like a really strange, contrived example in my opinion. But somehow that behind door number 1 there's a 99% chance, and somehow behind door number 2 there's a 1% chance. But in either case, it's infinite utility. Liz says, well, clearly we should go for the 99%. And Alex is like, hold on, that's not how infinity works. And Alex is right. That's not how the number infinity works. But also, infinity is not a number. It's a process or a set representation. So the first thing that I would do, which is just the mathematically correct thing to do, would be to decompose the infinity number into a set. We've already talked about that. But what we can do is we can maintain the proportion perspective into the set. And so that what we can say is, instead of 2 doors that lead to infinite utility, what we can say is that 2 doors lead to finite utility. Let's just say 1, because you're normalizing them. They lead to the same amount of utility. And so this same amount can be an infinite set. It would be 1, 2, 3. You see, it's a set. 1, 2, 3. The other door would be 1, 2, 3. So you're assuming a constant infinity, if you will. But those are a constant element at every position in the set, even though the set never converges. 1, 2, 3. It's infinity in the limit, but you never get to the limit. So at any finite position, it's still a constant. So you can normalize those. You can normalize sets. So you can treat it as a constant, divide it out, and just normalize it to 1. You can do that if you know that the sets are equal, and we're stipulating that because we have no reason to believe otherwise. Hopefully that logic follows through for you. So if we normalize them, then the proportions work, because now you normalize them to 1. Let's go for the 99% chance of 1 versus the 1% chance of 1. And you go through the door, and then you repeat that process on every time. So you go through the door on step 1, then day 2, it's 2, 2. You go through the door on day 2, and you always prefer the 99%. Using the door analogy, using the proportions, but you need to use set theory as well, or else it doesn't work. So this would be a repeated process of choosing the door every day. And I think, by the way, this solves for a problem that Alex has posed, which is like, in heaven, could there be a Holocaust? And I think logically there could be, disagreeing with the Catholic apologist Trent, who he also debated, saying that Trent said it would be impossible. I feel like I understand where Trent's coming from, but he just sort of made the remark that it would never happen. Well, actually, he made the remark that it's like impossible. And I think the implication was that it would be logically impossible. I'm not sure that I buy that it would be logically impossible, but I would buy that it would never actually obtain. And I would buy that it's not rationally expected. Because you can imagine, you would never expect anyone to choose the lesser door, right? And it could be there. There's no reason to logically rule it out. But people would just never want to do that. There could also be, theological things that happen, transformation of the mind, and resurrection body that doesn't have temptation towards sin and so forth. Even if that happened, I think what we would say is that with the elimination of non-holy preferences, there would never be a preference toward evil. That still doesn't logically rule out that evil might happen by accident or something like that. And then the other thing that I want to point out, just like a theological note, is in stories of the fall, and this is like highly debated, so let's not take this for sure. But in stories of the fall, some people say there was a rebellion in heaven, and that this led to Satan being cast out as an angel. So possibly bad things could happen in heaven. So I don't want to logically rule it out, but it also doesn't affect my steel manning of Pascal here. Okay, so we can preserve the proportion. We can preserve the proportions as long as we use set theory. I think that's the last point that I wanted to make. Non-set infinities are problematic. Yeah, I covered that. Opportunity cost and the hell of positive infinity. Yeah, so you could even have like a pleasant hell, where hell is linearly, as long as hell is less preferred to heaven, you could even have like a nice hell. Like maybe hell is just like our lives today. And this seems like an abstract theoretical thing, but I think it actually matters, because I want to come back and consider like what are the implications for our lives today. So one Christian school of thought is like heaven in the here and now, that you can actually start having a better life now by preferring Christianity now. And I think that's true. And we can point to statistics of like depression among non-believers, suicide rates, the relative success of the nuclear family, flourishing with Christianity, longevity among the religious and the married, higher self-reported happiness. The list goes on and on and on. Success rates of the children, success rates of the own parents. So there's a lot of positive benefits to being a Christian here and now. Those are statistical matters, but I think they're worth pointing out. So let's say that despite all of those, being alive is a good, even if it's you're not living your best life, to use some newspeak. Even if you're not living your best life, being alive is still better than being dead. Actually, this is where we get into troubled waters, unfortunately. And this is why this is not like a crux of the argument. But I think for most people, they would agree with that. And again, here we could point even to evolutionary incentives that would say that like there's an evolutionary drive to be alive. And so there's even on like a Sam Harris flourishing view, you would accept that being alive is better than being dead in some sense. And so that even if there's a positive return from non-belief, and let's say that extends into eternity, as long as belief is preferred, then the opportunity cost is growing and growing, and you always would have been retrospectively better off with belief. Yeah, and then there's an interesting point here. I don't think this is a crux either. I think the naive assumption of a linear infinity works, but what you could say is I don't know the shape of the infinite curve of utility. So let's average between a non-convergent, linear, and an exponential series. And what you would actually get is an exponential average. And so in that case, it's not just linearly better off to prefer belief, it's actually exponentially better off to prefer belief. That's probably the last note that I'll make. Yeah, so that was almost like 30 minutes. So thanks for hanging out with me. I'd love to hear your comments. I actually love to debate like an atheist, or just have a positive conversation, or even another Christian who's wanting to publish on Pascal's wager, and we could have a dialogue to steelman it and formalize it and write it out. I think you can actually write a set theory-based like mathematical argument. I hesitate to use the word proof, because at the end of the day, this is all sort of like subjective value argumentation, which is interesting. As an economist, I think it's really interesting, but it's not really decisive. I think it does favor Christianity, but I think it fits into a cumulative case for Christianity. I wouldn't want my Christianity to hang solely on Pascal's wager. But I do think if you're a genuine agnostic, it's genuinely 50-50, or even if you have some preference toward atheism, as long as it's a finite preference toward atheism, Pascal's wager should shift you. And see my prior video where I show that it's not intellectually dishonest to do so. It's actually intellectually preferred. See ya.